Good morning, everyone. My name's Denari. I'm a professor here at the Architecture and Urban Design Department at UCLA, and on behalf of Chair Heather Roberge and the entire staff and faculty and community here, I want to welcome you all this morning. Thank you for tuning in. And I think today's session, which will last about an hour, will include about a half an hour of my time going over, I think, broad points about the culture of the school. Feel free along the way to type in questions that primarily might have to do with admissions, but they can cover anything that I'm talking about. Our staff and colleagues here will be able to respond about questions along the way about admissions, and then after my presentation, I'll be able to take questions that go more into curriculum, content, and all the things associated with the department's ideas. Let's begin talking about our city, Los Angeles. If you're here in LA, you know that it's a world city. If you're not, you're also aware of that fact. It's 17 million people in a 60-mile radius. 150 different languages spoken here, one of the most diverse and complex populations in the world, certainly in North America. And in terms of North American cities, it's the city that, of course, resembles post-war development, horizontal city, as all cities that develop that way. In the 21st century, dealing with issues of growth, density, diversity, and how to essentially become a sustainable city. These are all the mysteries and questions that cities in North America, as well as around the world, are working on. And Los Angeles is indeed a laboratory for us here at UCLA. This photograph is from a helicopter trip I took over the city a few years ago. UCLA, which is one of the flagship universities in the UC system, is truly a great public university. Wall Street Journal and U.S. News and World Report rank it #1 in the United States in terms of public universities. Its status in the city has really been established over the nearly 100 years that the school has been in existence. In 2019, we'll be celebrating our centennial. The school campus is an interesting place in terms of its relationship to landscape, to many different eras of architecture. And the campus, too, represents a kind of microcosm of Los Angeles. It's a large school with 50,000 students and staff, making up a 60,000 person community of incredible diversity. And we have Nobel Prize winners all over the campus in so many departments. Our faculty is really regarded quite often as the strongest design faculty in the United States. Now, that's easy for me to say as being one of the members of the staff, but if I've heard it once, I've heard it hundreds of times, that the faculty here galvanized around the city of Los Angeles, and for many generations, really, form, I think, the nucleus that I'll talk about of the school. This is an image of the Emerson College School in Hollywood by Morphosis. That's Professor Tom Main's office. Tom was recently named by Design Intelligence one of the 25 most admired faculty members. He's been teaching architecture for more than 40 years and has been a professor here for 25 years, and is still active quite a lot in the school in the M.Arch.I program and Super Studio, which I will talk about. Further, this is the work of Professor Greg Lynn. If you're familiar with his work, you know that he also has established himself over the last 20 years as one of the great futurists, I would say, among those in our profession. Greg and Ellie Abrams and Adam Fury, Christy Ballier, Kelly Bear, Elena Manfredini, Jacqueline Bloom-Ha, all professors or graduates of the school, were included in 2016 in the Venice Biennale. This is Greg's proposal for one of the sites in Detroit. This is the work of Professor Hitoshi Abe, our former chair, who stepped down about a year and a half ago. This is a School of Economics in Vienna, Austria. His practice is based both here and in Sendai, and has worked around the world as one of the most esteemed expatriate architects from his home country of Japan. This is my project, which is in construction documents. It's a 10,000 square foot addition to a brick building in El Paso, Texas, near the border of Juarez and El Paso. It's a project for which our client asked us to make, as you can see, a dramatic statement to a city that he feels needs to be more activated in terms of the ambition to make great architecture. This is a project by Georgina Ulhich with her partner Marcelo Spina of Patterns. This is a housing project in Rosario, Argentina, which has won many awards. This is a project that was exhibited at the SciArc Gallery by Professor Jason Payne, who's one of the, I think, one of the central figures of his generation, who are the first wave of students trained in the digital project, shall we say. And Jason's analog, respect for the analog, shows up here in this experiment that he built. This is our chair's work, Professor Heather Roberts. This is also an exhibition in the same gallery at SciArc. This is from 2016. And this is a project which explored the nature of structure, geometry, repetition, and the language of the column. Sylvia Lavin is the director of the MA-PhD program and is an esteemed theoretician, historian, and critic around the world. And she's also a former chair here for 10 years between the mid-90s and the mid-2000s. This is a catalog called Everything Loose Will Land that was part of Pacific Standard Time and was a catalog of an exhibition held at the Schindler House. Everything Loose Will Land is a attributed quote to Frank Lloyd Wright, who said that about Los Angeles, which is by the time you take everything and loosen it up, it'll all land in LA. And in a funny way, we think that right now the landscape is tipped quite dramatically toward the West Coast in terms of people, ideas, and human resources. On the right is Professor Roger Sherman's work, and on the left is Professor Jimenez Lai. There he is in a self-portrait, Alfred Hitchcock mode almost, in his pavilion in Palm Springs. Aaron Besler is also a young faculty member and critic and architect here at the school, and this is part of a project on her her investigations into quotidian elements, the backyard deck, and built at a miniature scale. Let's see, this is the work also of Jimenez Lai at the Biennale in Chicago, which is on now. And allow me to just read the list of folks, and I'll get to them as well in their images. Sylvia Lavin was a curator for a piece of the show, which I'll talk about in a moment. Andrew Kovacs, Jimenez Lai, Aaron Besler, Juana Ix, all participated. Sarah Hearn, who's a PhD graduate from the school, was a co-curator along with Johnston Markley. Our alums, Ellie Abrams and Adam Fury of the group called Team, Andrew Holder and Ben Fryinger of Los Angeles Design Group were also in the Biennale. This is a piece by our faculty, Andrew Kovacs, who teaches in the core and also Advanced Topic Studios, and whose work you may know as the Archive of Affinities, his well-traversed, let's say, archive of oddities in the history of architecture. And we see Professor Wana Ix's tower in the group of 16 towers in the big room in Chicago, and Sylvia Lavin and Aaron Besler teaming up to make a replica of a project done in the Frankfurt Museum more than 25 years ago, here reproduced also at miniature scale. I'm going to speak mostly about the studio sequence, but this is just to tell you about the three main components to locations in one event. Perloff here on the Westwood campus is home to our M.Arch.I program and our undergraduate program. We have our BA in Architectural Studies, and we also, of course, host the MA and PhD students here. At Ideas in Culver City, our secret laboratory that's not so secret houses a lot of our advanced technologies labs. Each program has lecture series and curatorial projects and exhibitions. This weekend at Ideas, we'll be having a panel discussion about the idea and problems of transportation. And then what binds the two programs, the two locations, is Rumble, which happens in June at the end of the year. Rumble is a one-day of reviews, a previous day of events, parties, symposia, that really isn't replicated in any other school in the United States, which typically have reviews that move over the course of a week. This happens in this compressed time frame. Of course, our lecture series is renowned, I think, in the city, and as well as the graphic design that we work with in terms of promoting the work. We've had panel discussion on the Biennale. We've recently had Thomas Auer from Transsolar in Germany to talk about sustainability. We've had Fujimoto from Japan coming, and we have many other great people, both domestic and from Europe. Ending the year on May 21st is Brett Steele, former director of the AA and now our dean of the School of Arts and Architecture here on the campus. And here's an image of a nice packed house in the D Cafe where we hold our lectures here on campus in Perloff Hall. So Rumble, going back to Rumble, Rumble is an event, of course, that we look to all year long. It's when we invite critics from around the city, from around the world, to come in a very compressed time frame to essentially make an exhibition and an event and action art, I should say, all in one day. The work is all up. It's like a big exhibition. So everybody who comes to both participate in the reviews as well as see the work sees it in a kind of very comprehensive manner, and we understand, let's say, the trajectories, the differences, the challenges, the conflicts, et cetera, that are operating at the school. Including in Rumble, we of course present seminar work as well as the work of studio. That's me on the left, listening intently with the rest of the faculty to Professor Sylvia Lavin, who's saying something profound and gesticulating all at the same time. That's very typical. And on Rumble, we have our parties with mariachi bands, tacos, and lots of conversation in our courtyard at Perloff Hall. This is an image of my studio from 2015, work done for Rumble that also became a book called Chromatopia. It was a exploration of a site in the center of Shanghai to build 100-meter towers that merged the normative and the spectacular all into one typology. This project was presented at the Shanghai Biennale in 2015, and the book has been circulated since then. These are also images of our final reviews at Rumble here in the D Cafe. Again, this is work from the undergraduate program. This is Professor Greg Lin and an esteemed jury chatting about his work last year, which was about just-in-time delivery and the idea of the robotic warehouse and what that meant and what it means for us in terms of infrastructure, architecture, and daily life. This is also part of an exhibition at the Schindler House that was on the Eames. You can see them there. The tradition of Schindler, Eames, Neutra, designers who established the great modern legacy in Los Angeles are always very present in the exhibitions and in our teaching. Super Studio is now almost 10 years old. It began in 2008. I actually taught the first Super Studio in collaboration with Toyota in 2008. And since then, this program has been connected to the idea of research that is driven through and by relationships with industry partners. And we've had a wide array of industry partners, primarily in the technology industry, robotics, automobile, aerospace, etc. Our warehouse laboratory in Culver City is really an open, flexible space with tools and technologies, and 70 students who are all broken into 4 different studios working on different agendas. But it is really a one-room schoolhouse, and there's a huge amount of overlap and connection with the work. This is an image from Professor Tom Main's investigation last summer, or summer before last, into the development of a new city off the coast of China. You probably understand, having done research about architecture schools, that having robots is not the point, because most people do have them at this point. Ours are quite robust, and that alone allows us to carry out some experiments that others might not be able to, which is moving rooms, moving walls, moving spaces, shaping things around cinema and light, which of course begs the question of how computers, technology, and computer-aided design, especially robotics, formulates new ideas about space and the development of craft, fabrication, and construction. I think UCLA, especially Super Studio, is deeply invested in that project. That's Professor Craig Hodgetts on the left, and one of his students, and this is a mock-up from the interior of the Hyperloop vessel, which was a year-long exploration and continues in some ways with UCLA, about the future of high-speed transportation, of which Los Angeles and the West Coast is really the home to developing those tools and technologies. And there's Professor Hodges again with his students and an overview into the laboratory. And of course, the exhibitions for Rumble that we have at the end. Professor Tom Main's research has typically focused less on robotics and technology and more on urban futures and urban systems, of which he has published books on Los Angeles, Madrid, and Haiti over the years. City Lab is a special component to A.U.D. It's a research center begun by Roger Sherman and Professor Dana Cuff. And they're engaged in all sorts of projects, including this one, which was designed a few years ago with Kevin Daly architects, called the Bio Home, a small footprint kit of parts house, which is really aimed at being able to densify the city with a very light, sustainable footprint. This is a full-scale mock-up that the students built and was placed on our campus during Rumble. Pool is the student-run, student-generated publication project. There have been 2 issues. Began about 3 years ago with students, of course, who've gone on to graduate. Pool is editorially quite open, and all students are encouraged to get involved with Pool. But I would say that among publications in schools of architecture that are not completely controlled by faculty or administration, Pool has risen up the ranks very quickly to become not only a collector's item, but something of really substantial content. The graphic design is also incredibly beautiful. I'm going to run through the studios in the M.Arch.I curriculum. The first one is about organization and architectural form, 411 in the fall. And this particular studio, there's my colleagues listed at the bottom who've taught it. This is a project, again, I would say, formed around their interests of the quotidian, taking basic ideas like a tool shed and manipulating them both in terms of construction and the rhetoric of geometry. So students get a grounding not only in the fundamentals of, let's say, even basic architectural construction. More importantly, we begin the conversation about architectural form and the rhetoric of it. 412 is a jump in scale and a jump in complexity straight away into the winter. And this is a time in which we issue a more complex program. And we essentially look at issues around structure and spatial organization, primarily with a program that it has the ability to manipulate itself around those interests. TechCore is really an unusual and unique studio, I think, to all of American graduate core curriculum. Our tech sequence of seminars over the years became so popular and so robust that we decided to essentially convert one of our studios into a project that is a hands-on project. These projects are done in teams, and technology, both at the level of fabrication of objects and models, but also the way in which architecture is designed and built and thought through, come together in the TechCore program and the TechCore sequence. Various iterations of this studio have been undertaken over the years, depending on who's teaching the project. But generally, it has to do with understanding how envelopes work in buildings, how they work on a sustainable level, how they work on a cultural, even political, and of course aesthetic level. And the means and methods to build them is really directly connected to the ways in which models are made. In the second year, 413 Architecture in the Urban Landscape takes on generally issues of housing and repetition, as well as urban design and conditions in the city. So we move our attention to a repetitive program at a bigger footprint and with a greater impact with questions about the city. And here, growing interests about urbanity, sustainability, transportation, economy, access, democracy. All of these things, along with the tools that we give you to design with, are part of our conversation, especially in this studio on the landscape. Our comprehensive design studio, which happens in the second year, the winter, is an interesting scale. Many schools take on the comprehensive design at a much larger building scale. For many years, we've taken it on at the level of the house, and in particular, the steel house. These projects have emanated historically from projects like the projects of Neutra through Eames and on through more contemporary architects. To be at this point, not so much meditations on the strict language of steel architecture, but on the ways in which steel, the program, and in this particular case, a challenging hillside site come together. The major building design studio in the spring of the second year is a proto third year or options class. There are 4 groups. They're all working on the same project. It's a lottery that will prepare you for the lottery of the third year. This is a project which focuses primarily on program and the complexity of program. And in general, over the last few years, whether it's been horizontal or vertical, the issue of heterogeneity and disruption to a certain extent has been part of our language of operating with the content of the idea of program. The research studio is the year-long component in the third year. In the fall and winter, there are seminars that lead up with research and warm-up exercises and design charrettes into the spring quarter full design studio. I generally teach that at UCLA. This image is from last year's work by Professor Jason Payne, who focuses a lot on the issue of the object and in particular the estranged object, and this was for a site in downtown Los Angeles for the water and power. So thank you very much for coming. Please type in your questions about admissions, about other aspects of the program that I might be able to answer in terms of content, ideas, people, etc. But for now, thank you very much. While you're typing in your questions, I'd like to offer a couple of comments about portfolios, because that's, I think for every school you're going to apply to, and certainly for us, it's a big component, it's a big element. Your self-statement, grades, GREs, etc., they're all very, very important. Those are for you to pursue, obviously, on your own. The portfolio at UCLA, what we like to see is something that's rather straightforward, rather clean, and very much focused on the quality of your work. There is not a minimum or maximum number of projects to include. Speaking quite honestly, your main challenge is to be an incredible editor, which is don't worry about quantity, only include the quality projects in your work. They do not have to be chronological. It's best always to lead off with your best work, or what you think is the best and most accomplished work. In terms of layout, have it be simple. Keep a lot of white space. Make your typography simple. Only use one font. Be very clear. Be concise with your text. No more than a paragraph is necessary. Make sure that your images are all high resolution. You're sending in PDFs, and we don't want to see low resolution images or pixelated images that won't sell your project so well. So please be very diligent about both meeting our requirements for the size of the file, but also that the clarity of the file and the images is all very, very high. And those are the main tips that I have. Okay, so I'm going to start answering any questions that you might have that otherwise aren't being answered about admissions.
One from James Churchill.
I see. So James Churchill asks, is there any property owned by the university that they protect on an architectural basis? I'm not sure about the entire university, but in terms of our department, no, we don't. We have access to all of those projects quite easily. The rich history of residential architecture in Los Angeles is something that we incorporate and visit all the time. Let's see, if I were hopping on a plane to LA in 6 hours for the weekend and Monday, what should I do in relation to UCLA architecture? Well, if I interpret that as, I can interpret it one way as visiting work by UCLA faculty in the city. Well, that's an incredibly long list of projects by practicing architects here, as well as on Saturday night, we have a big symposium out at Ideas about the concept or the problem of gridlock. So when I introduced the idea of Los Angeles as this dream city, you know, at one level, Los Angeles is the city that has built its history on the future, and the future is both near, far, and past, and we're confronting these questions about sustainability and mobility. So there are buildings to go visit, there are events to take part of, and I'm sure that if you visited the school, you'd find a huge amount of effort being put into work always within the building.
What about the GRE? It went off the page. How important are the GRE? How important are GRE results?
How important are the GRE results is one question. Every component is important in the application. So nothing should be a weak link, shall we say, in a chain. So it is very important. I think everything is looked at and compared applicant to applicant. So one thing I would not say is that there's any less interest in any component. The GRE, of course, is for you to go out and do the best you can. In the case of the portfolio, which of course is also a big element, giving you these tips about how to put your best foot forward, I think is important. I think one thing about the self-statement, even though it's maybe not something that people are asking about, the self-statement, I think one thing to really think about is, quite honestly, you're applying to a number of schools, a number of our competitor schools. My advice to you is to write a special letter for each school. It takes more time, but when we read a letter that feels like it really is about the investigation of you to the school, that carries a lot of weight as opposed to one that just seems to be, shall we say, fitting for every school that you might apply to, or rather more generic. What else do we have?
Yeah, what are something?
Mm-hmm. What are some of the experiences that we're looking for in the personal statement? Well, I think, of course, every student who comes to the school brings a history, whether you're from near or far, and we love that. I think we're not necessarily concerned about the first time you started thinking about architecture or how early you imagined yourself entering into the profession. I think that what we want to hear from you is ways in which we can see that you're a critical thinker, ways in which your experiences haven't just been touristic, but have been very meaningful for you in shaping your worldview. So it's not so much about translating a resume or a CV into prose form. I think it really is about telling us who you are as a person and how you see the world, even though we also understand that you're young and you're being, you're still shaping your worldview, and it doesn't have to be firmly cast here. So it's not a recounting of stories. I think it's really what those stories mean ultimately to you right now in your life.
So if I'm understanding,
there's one about, is the curriculum studio based?
more about how our supporting classes, such as building technology, integrated studio, ensuring students understand the fundamentals of design structure.
Right. Okay. Right. So the rest of the curriculum, the question is about the integration of the allied classes, both required and potentially elective classes, into the curriculum. American education, which is different than a European process in education, of course, sets up core curriculum, as I laid out, primarily centered around studios. That's the biggest number of hours per week that you typically have. That's 12 hours a week, 3 studio days, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 4 hours. So work on other seminars and other classes, of course, comes before and after those classes on Tuesday, Thursday, and in the morning. So in terms of time and the way in which we integrate things, on the one hand, they're all discrete, and generally we don't apply a studio project to, let's say, the content of another class, which is more of a European model. Things are connected here. So for instance, in, say, the Steelhouse project, by this time you've had structures and also projects like the 412 project, the building design project, that prepare you for understanding both the way in which structure works in terms of statics and forces, as well as the language of the grid, as well as in the course itself, the history of steel construction, which you get in Intro to Building Construction in also the first year. So things are coordinated in terms of content, and they build sequentially upon themselves, and knowledge is always applied through the classes and through the courses. And as much as possible, especially in the core sequence, we have consultants in various disciplines, whether it's environmental, structural, mechanical, that or urbanism, for instance, that come and consult on studios, again, primarily in the core sequence. And they become a kind of interstitial glue that pull together the technical seminars with the design seminars. And I think it works both in discrete kind of packages of information as well as coordinated, let's say, constructs.
Other schools are more pragmatic.
So we have a question. Other schools are more pragmatic with their approach. I was wondering how you and the rest of the staff help newcoming architecture students transition to UCLA's style and method of teaching. That's a great question. It's interesting. Language, architectural language and architecture culture, of course, is always a new set of protocols and biases and customs and so forth. And any school, any office, any country that you work in, and UCLA, of course, is no different. I'd like to say that, at some level, when we talk about pragmatics, or when one talks about pragmatics, I would say that the school is not without its understanding of what all we might understand as being rigor, program, logic, those things are not necessarily just the domain of a school that might treat design as a less speculative culture. We take design as not something that's unhinged from the logics and protocols of what one might call pragmatics or the practical aspect of architecture, but we are training people to be critical thinkers as well as incredible craftspeople. So architecture as a discipline isn't taught as a vocation. It's not taught as a rote procedure. It's taught both at the technical level and the conceptual level with equal strengths. So we begin, for instance, by introducing you to computers in the fall of the first year, where you learn software if you haven't used software, both 2D and 3D software, illustration software, primarily around Rhino, V-Ray, and Illustrator and Photoshop, to technically bring you into, let's say, the graphic culture of what the school is. And that really happens very, very quickly. I think in terms of the idea of studio culture, individual critiques, group critiques, we know that every class that comes in M.Arch.I consists of almost roughly half students who studied architecture and those who did. And in essence, everybody comes up to speed, I think, very much at the same way. Even students who studied architecture find that once you get to UCLA, it is a much different culture than your undergraduate program that you might have had before. So it's essentially immersive. Once you get here, then it is really like taking on course lessons in how to speak a new language. And our faculty are very, I would say, sensitive to all aspects of learning curves and essentially coming connected to a new culture.
All right. What do you believe is, this is highly recognized. What do you believe is the biggest strength of UCLA? Schools.
So the question is, what's the biggest strength of UCLA over competitive schools? I think the core program, to be quite honest, is the strongest aspect of the school. While top to bottom, it's incredibly strong. I think that the ranking that we have now in the Design Intelligence Survey of number 6, I think reflects that. Really, the schools that are ranked from 1 to 6, I believe, in my humble estimation, represent truly the best schools, and I know other schools that are above us are going to be on your list, but UCLA's faculty and core program are, I think, unsurpassed. The programs that we see in other schools in option studios in, say, third year or thesis, which we do not undertake here, there's a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and even migration of faculty from time to time at schools. So when we think about our core program, this 2-year, 6-quarter project, with the introduction of something like Tech Core on the one hand as a way to, I think I go back to this issue of the pragmatic and the conceptual. That's a unique thing that binds very much the conceptual and the technical, because I've been teaching for 30 years. I've had visiting professorships at schools on the East Coast, also in Vienna and the Bartlett. And generally, we might understand that people imagine schools to be highly conceptual, highly speculative, and therefore less technical. And schools that, let's say, like a technical university in Vienna or in Stuttgart, are focused on the history of construction and systems. I don't know of any other school, especially in North America, that pulls both of those things together as well as we do. And so we give you a rigorous training in drawing. a rigorous training in understanding about geometry, of which you learned that very much in the first year. An understanding in urbanity and urbanism, in the social aspects of things like housing. Schools, our competitors, do have those components, but I believe that the way in which we structure the curriculum and the core and the way they fit together, and being here in LA, that the M.Arch.I especially program is the best in all the schools. There's a lot of overlap, but having taught in the core for as long as I've been here, I can say that for I think with great respect for the school and my colleagues and all the work that goes on here. Where do you see the one question is, where do you see the most opportunity for growth at UCLA over the next 3 years? Where do you see the field of architecture in academia heading? Well, I think if I understand the idea of growth at UCLA is certainly not about growing the number of students. It's about the intellectual capital of the school. And quite a lot of the focus is, and rightly should be, on issues of the city and technology, and how technology in relation to the city work. You know, one of the interesting things, here you are applying to architecture school, a medium that's been around for millions of years, and as a practicing architect, while we have new forms of delivery methods, buildings are still, when they're within the city, they're still made in concrete, wood, steel, glass, brick, traditional materials at some level. We've not yet graduated the idea that architecture could be made out of artificial materials and 3D printed. that's maybe coming. But here you are interested in working in the field of architecture in a time and with a future that will be increasingly digital, that will be app driven, that the smartphone will continue to evolve as a nerve center, both of distraction, entertainment, and of course, potentially information and education. So the fact that you'd like to be an architect and study at a school like ours, I think makes you incredibly special in today's world, because your friends or colleagues may want to make a living doing the very thing that you spend your time doing, which is maybe working on apps or going to work for Google, etc. I think, though, that when we think about the relationship between digital technology, not only about the delivery of architecture, potential uses of new fabrication and new materials, I really think it's going to be focused on the expansion of the space of the social within the built landscape. And I see a lot of that work being explored in Super Studio, as well as in projects in the M.Arch.I program. My focus personally in my studios, my research studios, have generally been urban speculations. Last year I did a project on what will be an empty Santa Monica airport site, which of course will be and has been a political point of political turmoil about what to do with it. So I think that that's where a lot of the expansion of growth of ideas and knowledge will occur, and will give our students, I think, a leg up in terms of either pursuing architecture that could potentially happen at large scales, moving into planning, even cultural affairs and things like that. So one might not practice architecture in a specifically traditional way. And in fact, one could engage in the relationship between the digital world and the physical world in a myriad of ways with the education that we can give you. One question is, are students without an architectural background at a disadvantage in terms of admission? Also, if the work in the portfolio is really varied, different media and so forth, is that worse than a more focused one? The first question is no, there's no disadvantage at all. We look at the candidates through all kinds of lenses and filters. But for sure, we look at candidates who don't have architecture degrees quite closely in relation to all the candidates who don't. And we clearly understand that portfolios that might have photography or studio art in them are quite different than portfolios for which a student who studied architecture would have one. They're both judged in terms of quality and in terms of the way in which I was talking about them, how much care you put into the file to make it beautiful, to make it clean. But there's no disadvantage at all, and in fact, we are always striving to find the best students, both who studied architecture and who did not, and understand and know and realize and want those levels of diverse backgrounds and different areas of study to come into the school. The portfolio, as I said, is also judged on its own terms, and generally, let's say within students who are presenting portfolios for which there were courses involved or not, or whether or not it's personal ambition or various media, et cetera. So we try to be very comparative and look at our applicant pool in a very, very fair way. Another question is, how is life in the M.Arch program? Is it busy? Is it more on cooperation or competition? Great question. I think UCLA's studio culture is pretty unique because it's a competitive culture, but in no way is it divisive or unhealthy. It's a very, I think, a strong community of people who want to share and who want to collaborate. And there's more collaboration going on, I think, than ever. You can't not be a competitive person deep down and be in this field because it is a challenge intellectually, even physically at times. And yet at the same time, we promote and foster an atmosphere of obviously inclusiveness and welcomeness, not only in terms of background, but ideas. So it is cooperative. And I think the best students and the best students are always thinking, and this is really most of our population, if not all, are really focused on moving their ideas forward as they go through the 3 years. And I think especially in today's world where digital technology keeps us all connected, even in studio, there's a great sense of sharing about tips, ideas, software, means and methods. And students do not tend to be covetous of their own private project. It's a great spirit. It's a great atmosphere. One question is, what are the main differences between M.Arch.I and M.Arch.II? Besides the previous degree that you need, which for M.Arch.II you need a professional degree, the equivalent of a Bachelor of Architecture or a major diploma from a school in Europe. Besides that, the main difference, and it's 3 years for M.Arch.I and post-professional for M.Arch.II. Maybe the way in which I would talk about it is not what the differences are, but how they connect. And we show you as M.Arch.I applicants, M.Arch.II, of course, you know the program, but in the third year, M.Arch.I students are all available to, the program, the M.Arch.II program is available to all M.Arch.I students to apply to one of the 4 studios. And each year we always have a few people who are interested in doing that. That's a commitment to one professor for a year, more like a European program, which have connected seminars, connected history and theory classes in a kind of comprehensive program, which of course takes place on our satellite campus in Culver City. I think in terms of The other differences between M.Arch.I and M.Arch.II, let's say that M.Arch.II tends to be much, much more material-based. The studios are focused on continuous forms of building experimentation because each quarter builds on the next. So let's say a rough idea or a rough model of a small working robot might be built in the fall and then continue to be developed in the spring. Whereas with M.Arch.I, the studios tend to be discrete elements working in 10 weeks and you move from one to the next. One question is there a preferred portfolio page layout which reviewers like the page displayed, i.e. a 2-page spread or a 1-page landscape? No, there's not a preferred way to think about it. The idea of a book or a spread can be very interesting and very beautiful. And if you're somebody who uses, let's say, a book that you love, maybe it's an art monograph or something like that, or a book on photography, as a model to see how facing pages talk to one another, that can be a very beautiful way of presenting the work. Let's say the downside of that would be 2 pages on the screen, because obviously we're looking at these on screens, might mean that we have to scroll in a little bit in the PDF and look around. Now that shouldn't put you off on that format, because if your work is really compelling, of course we want to, no matter what, dive deeper into the details. A very simple 1-page landscape is also very beautiful as well. I think the main question, the main thing is to be very cognizant of the content and how clean it is on the page. But any format, portrait, landscape, book spread, those are all fine. No preference. Another question is, portfolio guidelines online seem to suggest that creating a portfolio in InDesign as a book is not a preferred format, but should be done as 1-page increments. Am I misunderstanding this? Was it meant to imply not to use spreads? No. So that question, yeah, we can reference the previous answer, which is I would suggest doing the portfolio in InDesign no matter what, because it's the way in which you can control headers and footers, page numbers, gutters, borders, line spacing, etc. I teach my students about InDesign and making their portfolios in InDesign when they're graduating, because it's the best software that we have in the Adobe suite for, making the work. You don't obviously want to plop images on a page and not understand how they work with, let's say, a border, regardless of what type of format it is. I tend to think of them as books, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be like a traditional book with open spreads. It can be single pages, but you just want to have very clean, very repetitive graphic infrastructure. I think we've come to the end of time. It's 10 a.m. here out on the West Coast, and I want to thank everybody who's been online to listen to this. I hope it's been informative and beneficial. And of course, we do hope that you'll be submitting your application soon, and we look forward to seeing you at UCLA in the fall, in the spring for open house, and potentially next fall in the M.Arch.I and M.Arch.II programs. Thank you very much.